So I want to talk a little bit about the differences between environments that Cure Violence Global has traditionally worked in addressing issues of community-based violence, and the differences between community violence and the CURE-PDX context, where in the Pacific Northwest we're trying to prevent specifically ideological and politically motivated violence, which to me it has a lot of similar characteristics as community violence, but has some very distinct differences, including the geographic scope we're trying to cover, including people organizing along ideological lines via social media and the internet, right? So the spread of individuals involved in these groups is more diffuse and spread out over a large span of terrain, right? So I think there are some key differences, right? Maybe less instances of physical violence, but there are other kind of hostile tactics
Yeah.
that different groups use against each other, like doxing, harassment, that kind of thing. So, just in your experience, what are some key differences between conventional Cure Violence Global community-based violence work and preventing, political or ideologically motivated violence in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, every time we've kind of adapted the approach to other contexts or other kind of scenarios, right, or other types of violence, there is a big learning curve. No, not necessarily in the idea, but in the application of it, right? And so I'm gonna talk about one thing first, then I'll get to your answer. But so in Latin America, with some of our partners, this issue of gender-based violence and understanding actually all violence as gender-based violence, but specifically in Latin America, like what were the teams doing to address this? And so we really had to learn from experts in the kind of gender-based violence space to think about where it intersected with what we were already doing and what kind of additional training and support was needed for workers that were doing just kind of general community violence to understand some of the dynamics around gender and those things. Same thing with electoral violence that we did in Iraq, so, in other places. So I think in that we think about the Pacific Northwest, I think first and foremost, you're right that it's less number of incidents over a much broader geographic as well as ideological, i.e. reasons why people do things spread, right? And so I think we have to be A, in a learning mode always, but B, it's a much broader kind of approach, if that makes any sense, in that it's harder to identify and detect conflicts that we could actually step into and mediate because there's so far fewer of them, and they are in a much broader space, and they also exist online. And that's not to say community violence, like most of that comes from online stuff too, but it manifests itself in very specific geographic areas that are predictable based on previous years, right? So they're still happening in the same spots, but it's like the internet's just kind of like the new public square, if you will, and so that's very similar. I think the challenge and what we're working on together on this project is, given a much broader geographic spread, and we have to think about it in much more general terms, and a lot more folks are more apt to be violent, but at a much lower frequency, if that makes any sense. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of us are into real crazy ideas, myself included, right? That, you know what I mean? That believe, right, that violence is acceptable if a certain line or a certain thing is said, or, you know what I mean? And so I think there's a lot more folks that potentially could be involved in violence, but there's a lot less of them that actually do it, if that makes any sense. You know what I mean? And so it's like it's a different balance of trying to figure it out. And I think what's been exciting about thinking about this from a public health lens is the same way that we're not trying to be like judgmental of folks that are involved in gangs or crews or militias, and work with folks where they're at, is the same kind of lens we're putting at some of the ideological stuff, right? So there might be someone with like ideas that, like, me personally, I'm like, that's, you know what I mean? Like, I don't accept that at all. But if we're really trying to like prevent violence, folks need to be worked with and supported to, you know what I mean? To try and like, to engage where they're at and not be judgmental and not be like, oh, you're, a fascist, so whatever, you know what I mean? Like, and so I think there's where the public health approach can be helpful, is that we are trying to meet folks where they're at, I mean, the same thing in Honduras. Like, I don't agree with like killing people ever. Do you know what I mean? But you know what I'm saying? Like, but we got to work with the folks who are involved in violence to try and support them and make different decisions. So in the same idea, if someone's part of some whatever X ideology it is, you know what I mean, that I totally disagree with, still got to meet folks where they're at, and still got to work with them to think about this issue around violence. Our ask in the community violence is not to like stop selling drugs and stop being part of a gang or don't be part of this militia. The ask really has to do with how can we do this with less violence? Can we do this with no violence? And so I think a lot of the ideas and methodologies I think are very applicable, but I just think we're still working on how to do it kind of in a broader scale with less actual number of incidents. And that's where I think like the norm change work is important. Like this idea of like, as opposed to, and again, sometimes people don't like to hear this, but as opposed to trying like to get that kumbaya moment, right? Because there isn't necessarily going to be one, is like, how do we get folks even that have, ideologies that, you might personally think are abhorrent, like to stand down on some of this stuff and to kind of position their stance on violence, right? You know what I mean? And so I don't know. I think those are some of the things that we're working to think through. But I think a health lends itself to doing that, especially when the violence is, quote unquote, ideological, right? Because it's like if we can move away from, you know what I mean, of some of the ideological battle and get to like the practical, okay, so what? But does this mean you have to do X, Y, and Z? I think is sometimes a more fruitful conversation than trying to like uproot someone's, beliefs completely.